Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe on the SABC News Channel. The Central African Republic has declared a state of emergency as the army and UN forces are trying to repel advancing rebel groups who want to overthrow the government. The anti-government fighters, who now control 2/3 of the country, have surrounded the capital, Bangui.
The UN envoy to CAR has warned that the country is at grave risk. The rebels dispute the validity of President Faustin Archange Touadera's re-election in last month's poll. Authorities have accused former President Francois Bozize, who was blocked from running in the 27 December election, for the escalating violence. The Central African Republic has declared a state of emergency as armed groups try to lay siege to the capital, Bangui. It will last for 15 days and allow the authorities to detain suspects without the authorization of prosecutors. Rebel factions now control most of the country and are calling for the resignation of President Faustin Archange Touadera, the winner of December's election. Last week, the rebels launched attacks on the capital suburbs, but withdrew after an intervention by the UN peacekeeping force. The UN envoy has asked the UN Security Council for more troops. The fighting has forced nearly 60,000 people to flee the country.
To get a sense of what's unfolding in the CAR, we're now joined via Skype from Accra in Ghana by independent counter-terrorism and organised crime expert David Otto. David Otto, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme. The Central African Republic, I spoke to an analyst not so long ago, and he essentially said to me that for all intents and purposes, the Central African Republic is just Bangui, and the rest of it is completely out of control.
I think he's very right. What we have seen, even before the elections, is a country that is being run exclusively by the state in Bangui. The rest of the regions outside Bangui are being controlled by rebel forces. This is nothing new, but the hold or any of the kind of small hold that the government had or influence that they had out of Bangui, it's completely vanished after the what we've seen as the new rebel movement known as the CPC coalition. There are so many of these groups that came from the 14 armed groups that signed the Khartoum Agreement. So you have a government in Bangui that has little or no control of the situation out of Bangui. And even within Bangui itself, the government is struggling to have some kind of control. And that explains the recent 15 days state of emergency, because the government believes that Bangui is now under threat of being overtaken by these rebels that are linked to the former ex-president Francois Bozize.
Just before the election, we saw Rwanda and Russia come in literally to repel these rebels again because they wanted to stop the election and they were advancing on the capital. We even saw French planes fly over the capital. How close did they get, and are they close again this time around? And is it a question of time before they actually make their way into the capital?
I think it's a question of time. And why is that the reason? It's because there was so much focus to secure Bangui and have elections. And that is why you saw the presence of Russian forces. They deployed their helicopters, and you had the presence of France. But after the elections, the people of Central African Republic will be highly disappointed, especially those that are out of Bangui, because the government did promise that it will secure the population from the rebels. But you and I know that the government does not have the capacity to do so. They have not been able to have any kind of arms because they are under an embargo. Just today, there was a declaration by the United Nations that the arms embargo will be extended until November 2021. An expectation was that these arms embargo would be raised so that the government could be able to face the rebels that are outside of Bangui. So it's a long way to go for the Central African Republic. I think the government has won an election in Bangui and is now struggling to control the states outside Bangui. It is not going to happen under these circumstances. Not to forget that the geopolitics between Russia, France, and the other countries, is still not wiped out of the scenario. So it's a complex one, to be honest with you.
What do we know about these rebel groups? Are they united in their cause? I mean, if they were to advance on Bangui, is there a clear line of leadership in terms of who the power would be, or is it just a scramble for the capital and we'll see what happens later?
I think the person that stands out of these rebel groups, especially the CPC movement, the ex-president Francois Bozize has been the key figure. Remember that he, in 2013, led the anti-Balaka movement, which fought against the Seleka rebels, mostly Muslims. Now, what is happening now is you have about 7 of the 14 armed groups that split away and turned down the 2019 Khartoum Peace Agreement, decided to join the CPC coalition of Francois Bozize. And, we've seen some, statements that were posted just yesterday by the UPC, which is one of the movement of Ali Darassa, but also another movement calling itself the MPC. They said they denounced the violence by some of these armed groups. But today, we had another statement from, the leaders of the UPC saying, the previous statement that was signed on the 12th of January was a fraudulent document. Now, why am I giving you this detail? Is because, the rebels are simply saying we are united to take away and overthrow the government of President Faustin Touadera. So the rebels are united, and gradually they are buying the hearts and minds of the local population, considering that in their memorandum they've made it very clear that the population will not be attacked. The United Nations, which is MINUSCA, will not be attacked, but they've broken that, of course. Because we've seen the death of United Nations forces from Gabon and Morocco. So, the rebels are pushing forward towards Bangui. And the reason why you had the state of emergency is because the government is concerned and is losing it. So we have a very dire situation in our hands as we speak.
I was going to ask actually whether this is actually a popular revolt, and do they have the buy-in of the people on the ground? Or is it that they are grateful that they're not involved and affected by the conflict?
I think it would be a popular revolt very soon. Now, the rebels have used a very hearts and mind, known tactics. What they've made very clear is that they are not attacking the local population. And what that does is it forces the people to not go against the rebels because they are not the threat, or they are not the main threat. So what we see is the side of the government, trying to paint the rebels as against the local population, but they're not winning in that domain. So gradually, when the government begins to react by having all these states of emergency and locking up the country, added to the COVID-19 restrictions, what you'd have is a frustrated population which barely has any form of governance, turning towards the rebels. And that is where I believe is the danger here for the Central African Republic state. If they lose the hearts and minds of the local population, and if it becomes a popular revolt, then the government will be stuck with Bangui in their hands. And that means another country will be run by the rebels out of Bangui. And that is something which I'm concerned about.
What's in it for Russia and Rwanda in particular?
I I think for Russia, Russia has a clear bilateral agreement, which was signed between itself and the Central African Republic for training. Rwanda also has the same bilateral agreement. Of course, you have Rwandese who are part of the United Nations mission in Central African Republic. But the interest is always back to their country of origin. Russia is not there to assist Central African Republic for nothing, just like Rwanda isn't there to assist them for nothing. I think, the interest there is to have the control of Central African Republic. Remember, Bangui and Central African Republic is situated in a very strategic position. Borders with Cameroon, DRC, Congo. There is a route there that takes you directly to the Lake Chad Basin, Chad and all that. So, anyone who controls Central African Republic with its wealth buried under the ground, would have the whole of Central African Republic, this whole of Central Africa as a region, under their belt. So for Russia and Rwanda, that is the gold mine. Defending Central African Republic against the rebel leaders is just an objective. The biggest, achievement for them will be to have control of Central Africa as a region.
All right, 60,000 people, I believe, have fled the country. And if these rebels, these insurgents, are not harming anybody, why are they running away?
There is a whipping of the narrative that the rebels will soon change their minds. And the first instinct of human beings is to escape violence, or where there is some kind of an indication that things might turn bad. So people have been very cautious. And the experience of 2012, 2013 is very fresh in the minds of Central Africans, where people were brutally murdered in what was a genocidal crisis. Now, nobody wants to have a repeat of that. And that is why you see people fleeing in their numbers. Now, it is not because they are being attacked by the rebels. It is because, of the experiences of 2012, 2013. So, that explains the reason why you see these movements.
Where is France?
I think France is there, but the question is what is France doing rather than where they are. Very little, of course. The Central Africans that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to quite a number of them, they are accusing France of supporting the rebel forces. Now, we haven't seen any direct support from France, but we cannot rule out an indirect support, not just from France, but perhaps from other countries that have interest in the instability of Central African Republic. Remember, the war economy is one of the most powerful, and Central African Republic has always been under the control of France, and I think one of the mistakes that France made was to advise the government to seek help from elsewhere. And, I know of sources who have made it very clear that Russia was the choice that they were directed towards. Now, perhaps, France believed that Central African Republic will not succeed to seek the assistance of Russia. So, in as much as there are internal crises going on in Central African Republic, I think the biggest one is the geopolitics between France and Russia, but also China. The decision by the United Nations Security Council to maintain the arms embargo, is a decision that has been fought by France, Russia, and China. So this is where France is, and this is what they are doing or not doing in the case of Central African Republic.
All right, so a state of emergency has been declared. What will it do, if anything?
When a country decides to declare a state of emergency, it gives you one specific angle to look at. It means the country, the state does not have control of its territory. In times, what they call in French, en temps normal, that is in normal times. So it means that the government does not have the capacity to control the country's security. So you impose a state of emergency, so it gives you enough time for you to understand your targets and see your targets very clearly. To be honest with you, will it make a difference? I don't think so. The rebel groups will wait, and they will carry out their attacks when they can carry out the attacks. So, from a strategic or tactical perspective, it will change nothing. But let's see how it goes. But it's not looking good, to be honest.
All right. So if you were a betting man, might you place a bet that Francois Bozizé might be back in power at some time?
I think, it will be difficult for him to come back to power. But it would also be difficult for the person who is in power to have control. The government has the power. Faustin Trodora has the power, but I think Francois Bozizé now has the biggest control of Central African Republic. How the government turns that around is a matter of dialogue for me. I mean, as an African specialist, what I would encourage is for both men to sit down and have a dialogue. Never underestimate the power and the connections of a former president like Francois Bozizé. So my advice is both sides will not win using the current tactics. They've got to sit down and establish some kind of an agreement. This is for the betterment of South Central African Republicans.
David Otto, thanks very much indeed for your insights this evening. Great talking to you.
Thank you.